You can do a lot of things that are wonderful and you think you're doing everything right, like you're exercising, but you don't build muscle properly because you don't have the hormones to sustain proper function of your muscles. Like if a man has no testosterone, and the men know this, if they're exercising, they don't have any testosterone, they're not going to build the muscle. So if you're filled with endocrine disruptors that are preventing you from properly making testosterone, you're not going to get the same benefit.
This is Doctor Talks.
Welcome, everyone. We have exactly what you need. And why am I saying that? Because there's so many conversations about fasting, so many conversations about weight, etc. And there's this consistent theme of, well, is there a difference for women? How do our hormones play a role? Why is it that some women can do it every day, some women need to do it twice a week, and they're just variable outcome? How do we hyper-focus and create a fasting regimen that considers things like our estrogens? And we're going to dive into that today with Dr. Felice Gersh. So thank you for joining us, first of all.
My pleasure.
And your belief is that there's this relationship between fasting and estrogen that we need to understand, that there's some nuances there that makes the protocols more specific. So before we even get into that, maybe break down for us, because you have so much experience, OBGYN, this is what you do day in, day out. Break down estrogens first, because everyone thinks they know, but they don't really know. There's various versions. So let's start there, and then we'll get into the fasting part of it.
Well, that is a good place to start because the poor estrogens are so confused. And I do have some easy to sort of think about analogies. So estrogen is a family of hormones. It's not a hormone. And so my analogy is fats. So everyone knows that there's different kinds of fats, and they have different health benefits or potentially health harms. So there was that evil fat that was manufactured called trans fat, which is supposed to be off the market, of course, because it was very harmful. It kept things from spoiling, but it also ruined your body. And so the whole concept of fat became, fats are evil, don't have fats, but they're essential fats. In fact, fats or fatty acids are essential to life. And that's sort of a similar thing that happened to estrogen. So there are different types of estrogens, and there are some types that are actually xenoestrogens. So they're not even human-made estrogens. They're made by man. They're chemicals that are estrogen receptor modulators in a very bad way. They're endocrine disruptors, and they get into the body and they disrupt the way estrogens can bind to receptors, how they're manufactured, distributed, eliminated, detoxified, and everything. And they're confused with the human ovarian-produced estrogen called estradiol, the formal name 17-beta estradiol, which binds in a beautiful, balanced way with the different estrogen receptors. So it's an amazing life hormone. Although it's called a sex hormone, I have transformed its name into life hormone because it's really essential for the functioning of every organ system. There are receptors for estradiol on every single organ to make the body work as a whole with a united, look into the future for the health of that individual. But there are other estrogens that could be made, for example, by fat tissue in the body, especially in a state of inflammation. And it upregulates an enzyme that is present in fat that's all over the body that can convert androgens, which are like male type hormones, which can come from testosterone made in the ovary, or the majority from precursor type to testosterone androgens like DHEA, DHAS that come from the adrenal gland. And in fat tissue, in a state of inflammation in the body, what's produced is estrone, and estrone only binds to one type of estrogen receptor called the alpha receptor. And that type of estrogen receptor is more like, you can think of it as the on switch to inflammation. And whereas the estradiol from the ovary, that turns on appropriately inflammation when needed, and also turns it off and promotes healing and resolution. So we have an imbalanced sort of an estrogen state when you have an inflamed body and you have a lot of body fat. And of course, in pregnancy, the placenta makes a totally different dominant estrogen called estriol. And then there's a fetal estrogen. We won't even go into that one. And that's called E4. So there are these different estrogens, but they're so confused. And then a lot of times pharmaceutical estrogens are called, well, they're called estrogens, like estrogen, ethinyl estradiol from a birth control pill, which is a totally different formulation. And then what was given to most women in menopause for many years, it's still even used, which is conjugated equine estrogens. And the brand name is Premarin, which is derived from pregnant horse urine, which is not contains all these different types of horse estrogens that the horse is trying to eliminate from the body. So you can see how massive confusion has arisen from just the word estrogen.
Yeah, my head is spinning right now. I thought I knew something, but now it's like, well, there's a lot more to know. And this is why there's so much complexity and confusion, because people do walk around thinking one word, one meaning. And there's so much more to know. And when you try and answer a question, you perhaps are even asking the wrong question to begin with. And then you start looking at a whole other layer, like, okay, what is my progesterone all about? How does that play into this equation? And then there's a whole other conversation to have. So now, given that landscape that you painted, where is it that we see this challenges start, where fasting, the protocol, the structure needs some nuanced uniqueness around hormones? And what's the trigger? What do we need to consider? What drives how we design their fasting?
Well, we have to think of it a little differently depending on the stage of life that a woman is in. So if we start with the reproductive years, well, women who are making their own natural hormones, so they're not on a hormonal contraceptive like a birth control pill. We'll leave that, we can come back to. That's like a whole separate category of women. Mm-hmm. So the women who are having their natural menstrual cycles, well, you have fluctuation in the magical hormones. Estradiol is fluctuating throughout the whole cycle, and so does progesterone. Half the cycle, you don't even make progesterone from the ovaries. So how you fast will have an effect directly on the menstrual cycle, and vice versa. The hormones will affect the outcome of the fasting. So like so many things in the body, it's bi-directional. So for example, if you do fasting, and by fasting, you could say fasting is anytime you're not eating, right? But there's so many different nuances to fasting. So let me say somebody, and this is where the studies came in, and these studies were actually funded by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, back in the 1990s. There was a flurry of interest in this topic. And then what happened after the whole sort of horrible outcome from the Women's Health Initiative, so much interest in doing research on women's hormones kind of dissipated. But if you go back to the 1990s, when it was so interesting and so many people were looking at this issue, they did studies where they had women fast, completely water fast, for 2 days, sometimes 3 days. So that would be more like a periodic fasting. And what they found was that if they fasted during the first portion of the menstrual cycle, which is called the follicular phase, so this would be before ovulation occurs, guess what? In women who were normal weight, that they often would stop ovulating. And if they were underweight, almost exclusively, they would stop ovulating. So you don't want to fast during that time frame. And in women who were overweight, they didn't always necessarily stop ovulating. These are women who were ovulatory, but they found that their peak of estrogen was diminished. So it did affect how the hormones were produced by the ovary. But when the women did that same fasting routine, like 2 or 3 days after ovulation occurred, so this is called the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, it didn't affect ovulation in the subsequent cycle at all, but what it did during that cycle was it improved heart rate variability, which means the autonomic nervous system is better functioning. You have what we call more vagal tone. So the body is basically in a calmer state. It helped women who had PMS, where they had this kind of upregulation of the sympathetic tone of the autonomic nervous system, which is like the stress response, which of course is not a pleasant state to live in on a continual basis. So it was actually amazingly calming. They felt better. So women who are having regular cycles, they need to be aware that they should only do their fasting of that sort if they're going to be in the luteal phase. And if women are trying to get pregnant, then for sure, 100%, they should never do that type of fasting. And in fact, I actually don't recommend that any woman who is actually trying to get pregnant would do any kind of multi-day fasting, because the nutrient sensors in the brain may shut down reproduction, or like it happened in some of the women who were overweight. And these were not massively overweight. They were just like a little bit overweight. And what happened is their estrogen spike, which is what induces and precedes ovulation, was diminished. So that means that you may have a poor quality egg that's being selected, or you may not have proper ovulation, and then you won't have a good embryo made. And then you may also not have proper progesterone produced, because it turns out that that big spike of estradiol that's produced that helps to initiate ovulation actually sets up the progesterone receptors. So that progesterone, when it's made in the second half of luteal phase, will function better. And of course, progesterone is essential for fertility and successful implantation and production of healthy eggs. So it's really essential that to sustain a pregnancy, to have a pregnancy, you need to have healthy progesterone levels. That requires that high spike. So you can see where fasting has a big relationship. And then as well, when you have estrogen on board, you'll have better results from your fasting. So that's why menopausal women may not have as good a result if they have multi-day fasting, because estrogen in the form of estradiol, it actually regulates some very key functions in the body which are not well recognized. For example, autophagy, which is like intracellular house cleaning and renewal, that is really modulated or regulated by estradiol. And also programmed cell suicide, which happens, for example, at the end of a menstrual cycle, when you're sort of purging the lining of the uterus, you're also purging yucky, bad senescent cells of the body, these old cells that can develop misfolded proteins that can lead to cancer, and also senescent cells, these old cells that promote inflammation. So it's estradiol that promotes cell suicide for these bad cells. And fasting, we now know, like these short multi-day fasting can actually promote autophagy, where you have cellular renewal, and also the yucky cells of the body to kill themselves. So to have really all these optimal benefits from fasting, you really need to have estradiol present. So there's so much that interrelates between these two systems.
And so you were talking in the context of a longer, 24-hour, 36-hour fast. And what we're seeing a lot of is the daily intermittent, condensed eating window. So is it the same consideration there that, follicular phase, that could be a challenge?
So there's some different things. So I always recommend the daily type of fasting. So we said, like, fasting by definition is you're not eating. So there are different ways that you can fast. They have different benefits, and they can have different relationships with our hormones. So when you have what is often referred to as time-restricted eating, so that would be fasting during the 24-hour time frame of the day. So that would be sometimes where you don't eat for several hours in a row, and that is very good for the body. But then you have to say, well, which hours, and how is that going to impact the hormones? Well, it turns out that that miracle life hormone, estradiol, has receptors in the brain in what is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's a collection of neurons that sits on top of the optic nerve and can sense light and dark, and also has nutrient sensors. So it can tell if you're eating or if you're not eating, like fasting. And that group of neurons is called the master clock. And it sets the clocks of all the different organ systems in the body so that all the different organ systems are working in the same time zone. So we do want to have what we call a regulated circadian rhythm. And circadian rhythm is the 24-hour rotation of our Earth on its axis, which has somehow by a miracle has related to all life forms on Earth to have evolved on planet Earth to have genes that are clock genes, and they are all about survival, because some creatures like humans are diurnal. So we function metabolically in a very active way during the day, and we're very different metabolically at night. And then, of course, there are nocturnal creatures like owls and rodents that become more active and metabolically functional in an active way at night. Well, these are programmed into our genes. So we have our master clock, and then all the different cells of our body have peripheral clock genes, and they all work together to keep everything working in a beautiful synchrony of the body. And when we eat, it's really important to recognize that we have to eat in accordance with our clock genes. And so our digestive system, for example, is most functional during the early part of the day. So we digest better. We have better motility of the gut. That's why they talk about, like, it's very healthy if you have a good big breakfast and then you have a good bowel movement shortly thereafter. That shows your digestive system is working. And the other thing that's very important is our insulin sensitivity is best in the first half of the day. So when we eat food and we get a little bit of increase, hopefully not a gigantic spike of glucose, that the insulin that it takes to regulate that glucose to get it out of the blood and into the cells that need it to create energy, it takes less insulin. That's good, because we don't want to have really high insulin, because too much insulin can promote inflammation and too much fat production and fat storage. So you're more likely to have better regulation of your glucose and insulin when you eat more of your food in the early part of the day. Now, if you're eating like you think, oh, I'm a night owl, but there are no humans that are nocturnal. So there are some human variations, but will never turn into owls. So there really is no real night owl. So, but if you eat a lot of your food at night, your digestive tract is not going to be working optimally at that time. You're more likely to get GERD, heartburn, indigestion, and bloating, and you'll end up having higher glucose levels, and you'll end up having bad insulin levels, and you're more insulin resistant, and then you'll be metabolically less healthy. So time-restricted eating is a very, very important thing, because it allows time when your gut isn't digesting and it's resting and it's repairing, and the gut microbiome gets to sort of reset. But it's important to realize that actually, and this is so little recognized, that estrogen, having proper levels of the estrogen from the ovary, and by the way, men they should love estradiol. They don't realize how much they have, because all these things I'm telling about estradiol, they actually are happening in men too. But the way men get estradiol is their testosterone is converted into estradiol in the tissues themselves. So that's called paracrine. For example, the male brain and the male master clock needs estradiol too. So how does it get there? Well, men don't have high levels of circulating estradiol, but they have high levels, hopefully, of circulating testosterone. And all estradiol comes from testosterone, 100%, not half of it, not a third of it, 100% of estradiol, the estrogen produced by the ovary, that wonderful life hormone, comes from testosterone. And testosterone is made in the ovary. It's also made, of course, in male testes. And in the ovary, they have a special enzyme there, aromatase, to convert the testosterone into estradiol in the ovary. Well, this enzyme exists in the brain too. And the testosterone that men have circulating, it gets into the brain, and locally in the brain, it's converted into estradiol, so it can help keep the male circadian rhythm properly working. And that's why men having good testosterone is so important for their metabolic health, their emotional health, their mental health. Every part of their body needs testosterone. And a lot of it, of course, is because testosterone works directly on receptors, but also because testosterone can be converted all over the body in a man into estradiol. So estradiol is important for every human, male and female. And it's really critical to have these hormones, male testosterone, female estradiol, so that the master clock will function properly. Otherwise, the word that we use is it drifts. It actually kind of just gets off the proper setting. And then that will affect how all the different fasting mechanisms are going to work, because it's going to reset like your proper clocks in your intestinal tract for digestion, and the mitochondrial function may be off, so you won't create energy as well. And all the different organs like the liver, they're going to be off some. So to get all the optimal benefits of fasting and to get everything working properly in the body, you do need to have these vital hormones, and in order for all the systems to work in proper synchrony perfectly together.
So from listening to you, there's a clear value and importance to estradiol, regardless of male, female, right? And earlier on, you talked about some of the estrogen mimics that we don't want, some of the toxic estrogens. So how do you play this balance of, when you mention men, it comes to mind like a lot more men now are thinking about the endocrine disruption that's happening and what they're taking in and how they're becoming more estrogenized. But at the same time, there's some benefits from estrogen they need. So how do you play that balance of maintaining the estradiol that you need, the healthy stuff, while detoxing or clearing and eliminating the problematic stuff?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because we live in really a chemical soup of endocrine disruptors. Everything that's made out of plastic, soft plastic, hard plastic, they have phthalates, bisphenols. We know flame retardant, stain resistant products. There's so many heavy metals. They, like, people don't realize lead, mercury, they actually are also endocrine disruptors. And when you don't have the proper endocrine hormonal system, it's not just estradiol and testosterone. There's this like cascade of effects, like among thyroid and cortisol. All of these hormones work in this beautiful interplay with each other. And when you get out of whack with one, you're going to mess things up. If you don't sleep properly because you don't have the right estradiol, you're going to mess with your cortisol, you're going to mess with your melatonin, and then that's going to feed back and mess with your ovarian function, your testicular function. So these endocrine disruptors are having dramatic effects on men with their sperm production, their testosterone level, for women with fertility, irregular cycles, and it's just a gigantic problem. And it's very much something that we all have to be aware of. Everyone should be really an environmentalist, both on a global scale and on a personal scale. Like, think about personal care products. What are you putting on your skin? Everything gets absorbed to some degree. What's in your food? What's in your containers that you're storing food in? Are you putting it in hot? When you do takeout foods, do you let it sit in those containers that are lined with chemicals that get absorbed into the food and are endocrine disruptors? And when this happens, what happens is that you can do a lot of things that are wonderful and you think you're doing everything right, like you're exercising, but you don't build muscle properly because you don't have the hormones to sustain proper function of your muscles. Like, if a man has no testosterone, and the men know this, if they're exercising, they don't have any testosterone, they're not going to build the muscle. So if you're filled with endocrine disruptors that are preventing you from properly making testosterone, you're not going to get the same benefit. The same thing with fasting, of all kinds of fasting. You're just not going to get the same benefits if you don't have the hormones, because there's this interplay between cellular function on a molecular scale, mitochondrial function and so on, requires having these proper hormones present. And of course, mitochondria create energy, something that gives us life. That's like the spark of life, is the creation of energy. So endocrine disruptors are destroying really our fertility and our overall health. And so we need to think about what we're eating, how we're storing our cleaning products, and just really everything we put on our bodies, and get air purifiers, water purifiers, do everything we can to what we call lower the total body toxic load, because it'll allow your optimal results from your fasting routines, from your exercise routines, and so on. because unfortunately, it, like when they talk about it takes a village, it does, it takes a village to stay healthy. You have to look at all these different factors, because you can't just take out one thing like, oh, I don't have hormones, but that's okay. No, it's not okay. Or no, I don't go to sleep at night. No, that's not okay either. Or I eat at midnight every day. No, that's not okay either. So you just have to, unfortunately, staying optimally healthy is hard work, and we have to do it all.
Yeah, you do. It's work, and the more of these conversations we have, every piece is important, and we're blessed where we can learn from people like you, specific pieces, and dive deep. But you start to see the picture is painted. It's this very complex, a machine of multiple parts of which you can't focus on any one area because they're all connected. So, and then same thing with hormones, where so we've been talking about estrogens, we've been talking about estradiol, for example. Another area that comes up commonly when we're talking about fasting is, oh, it's going to stress my body, it's going to cause me cortisol issues, I think it's bad for my thyroid, and these are conversations that we hear from patients, from clinicians. So what's that interplay between fasting in these two areas, cortisol and thyroid?
Well, one of the things that happens when you exercise, when you fast, is you do create what hopefully is just the right amount of stress. So we know that the body has the mechanisms to deal with stress. If you overstress the body, then it may not recover properly. And so you don't want to do, so I really talk against many long day, like multi-day fasting, because that is too much stress on the body. So for example, the most that anyone should ever water fast would be 4 days. You just don't want to keep water fasting. It does become too stressful on the body. If someone is recovering from a heart attack or a major surgery or some shock to the body from whatever reason, an accident or something, that would not be the time to do multi-day fasting of any sort. But when we're talking about someone who is healthy, then their body can definitely benefit from these little stressors, whether it's like a good workout, an exercise workout, or a multi-day, but periodic. You don't do it days after days after days. You give your body a break. So you always have to remember that to get the optimal benefit from, say, a multi-day fast, which would be 3-4 days water fast or a 5-day fasting mimicking diet, if you do that, you need to have the recovery phase, which is just like after exercise, you have a recovery phase. After fasting of a multi-day type, you have a refeeding phase. And the refeeding phase is just as important as the fasting phase to get optimal results for the body. So you do want to pick the right persons to do such things as multi-day fasting, because you don't want to take someone who is fragile, who's very underweight, that type of person who has tachycardia, cardiac arrhythmias. Those are not the people that you would do multi-day fasting. When it comes to time-restricted feeding or eating, or what we so often talk about as intermittent fasting, where you're fasting during the time frame of the 24-hour day, where you have maybe, a 12 or even as low as an 8-hour window of eating, which is totally fine, as long as you get in all the nutrients you need. So it's really timing your eating, not restricting your eating. You're going to get all the nutrients you need, but you have all these benefits of giving your body this metabolic resting phase during the 24 hours. And that is really something that virtually everyone can tolerate, except the very ill or the very underweight, someone who's trying to gain weight. Those are the only people that I say you should maybe have a snack every 2 hours. Otherwise, snacking all during the day is going to keep your glucose going up, and then your insulin and goes up, and then you're going to have all these ups and downs. And that actually isn't good to have high levels of glucose and insulin on and off all day. The people who have the most trouble with the time-restricted eating, where they get into a smaller window of eating during the day, are people who do not have metabolic flexibility. And that's really important to understand, that there are some people that don't transition well from burning glucose to burning fat. And that's because they've been so carb heavy with these sugar foods that turn into glucose very readily, that they keep having high glucose levels come into their body. So their bodies never have to access their storage fat as an energy source. So the body is amazing for survival. Human beings are around today because we are so good at surviving famines. That's how come we have not become extinct. Well, that mechanism of transferring from burning glucose to burning fat should be seamless. You shouldn't even feel it. You shouldn't know it's even happening. But for people who have this very bad state of metabolic inflexibility, they just don't have the wherewithal with their metabolism, their mitochondria, to convert from burning glucose to fat. And they go through this little time frame when they actually get hypoglycemic because they're not really accessing their fat, and yet they don't have enough glucose because they've been not eating for a few hours or even a few days, like a couple of days, and they go crazy. They feel, I'm going to die. I must eat. That's like, those are the people who get, where they're hungry and angry, the angry people, right? Because they're like, oh my God, I'm famished. Like, when is food coming? When are you serving dinner? Why is food not on the table yet? And those people need to realize the reason they're having so much trouble is because they have this metabolic inflexibility, and they need to work on it by detoxing their body from garbage food, okay? Like, stop eating all those processed foods, those highly processed carbohydrates that turn into sugar so rapidly, and get back to a whole foods organic diet where you eat food that does not rapidly go into your bloodstream as glucose. And so you eat like healthy fats. We talk back to fats. You don't eat trans fats. You eat healthy fats in your diet. You eat complex carbs, like whole grains. They're not powderized. They're not turned into flour. So it would be whole grains. So it would be like, you cook it like rice, but it would be the ancient grains like buckwheat and millet and quinoa, amaranth. A lot of the grains people like, I never heard of that kind of grain, but those are the ones that help to actually control blood sugar. And you cook them and eat them like old-fashioned slow-cooked oats or steel-cut oats, that type of thing. And those are okay as carbs. And then lots of vegetables, with the antioxidants, the polyphenols, and all of those kinds of things. And then work on all the other lifestyle habits. And you can restore your metabolic flexibility so that it won't be a problem. But like in terms of any kind of activity, yes, it can be overdone. People can overfast, people can over-exercise, people can do all kinds of things to stress their body. You have to do it just right so that you get just the right amount of stress, so that you trigger the right mechanisms. Like your body, if you don't do a multi-day fast, like a 3-4 day water fast or the 5-day fasting mimicking diet, your body won't go through that little stress that will cause it to actually do, I call it major rehab, because it's only under the stress situation that you'll trigger certain cellular mechanisms like autophagy, cellular intracellular cleansing, where you take old structures in the cell, you break them down to their like essential parts like amino acids, fatty acids, and then you reconfigure new structures in the cells. You won't kill off old yucky cells unless you actually do some stressing of the body. So if you continually eat, nonstop eat, these life-saving, amazing, like healthy longevity mechanisms will never be triggered. So fasting can, yes, anything can be done wrong, but done correctly, it is amazing. We don't have proof of, extended life in humans, but they have it in rodents. And, because it's, how do you do studies on longevity in terms of extending lifespan for humans? That's like almost impossible, but you can do it for rodents. And they found that doing proper fasting, you can extend the life, the lifespan of rodents. So even if you're not going to extend life, what you extend is health. So that's where the emphasis now is on health span, right? So that you live as long as you can, but you live in an optimal state of health. So absolutely, I mean, I have to emphasize so dramatically that done properly, you can actually have such amazing metabolic health, restore your metabolic flexibility, have optimal health span potential when you do fasting correctly. Live with your circadian rhythm, recognize that hormones matter, and you add in all the other important lifestyle ingredients for health, and you can really optimize the quality of your life.
You're inspiring me to the point where I feel guilty that I even have lunch ready today. You know, like I'm gonna skip it and go straight to dinner, you know.
No, eating, but you remember refeeding is essential. The
Yeah,
food
yeah.
you eat after, I know, it's like everything in life, whoever came up with this little expression of, everything in balance, I don't say everything in moderation, because chemical endocrine disruptors, we don't want them even in moderation, but everything in balance is really the way to go. So, the Chinese got it right. I don't know how they were so brilliant so many thousands of years ago with their, yin yang, you have the hot, the cold, the push, the pull, you fast and you eat, and you always do it in the right balance.
Yeah. So another thought where, I mean, it's not a context we talk about a lot, but so you talked about in general some amazing stuff about how to fast in the female context, considering your estrogens, right? Then you touched on, well, now that you're menopausal, there's some different considerations. There's this gray area of perimenopause where a lot of women say, well, I don't get answers because I'm not there and I'm not there, but I don't feel like the way I used to feel. What do I need to do differently, if anything?
Well, first off, I just want to say that I am a huge proponent of hormone replacement therapy, to use hormones, the human bioidentical hormones at physiologic levels, to somewhat, we can't really do it exactly, but somewhat replicate the optimal hormonal rhythms of a reproductive, healthy young woman in menopausal women. And you're right, the biggest question mark is the perimenopausal women, those transitioning women where hormones can be in just sort of a chaotic state. They can go too high and then they can go too low, but the trajectory is always downward. It's like it goes up, but it then goes down. But every time it's like going down, like the worst stock market, it goes down, down, down. But occasionally you get a spike, along the way, just to make it crazy. But the bottom line is that I believe that women in menopause should have hormone replacement because their ovaries cease to make any estradiol or progesterone.
Right.
And I believe in supplemental hormones. So it's replacement in menopause and it's supplemental hormones for women that are in the transition or perimenopause. And that can really help. I do a lot of testing. Like, I love data. Okay. So, and now you deal with testing. I love data because it allows us to make informed decisions rather than just guessing. So I will often do menstrual mapping on my women who are still cycling, but they don't feel right. I mean, nothing feels right. They're not sleeping right. They can't remember words. And this has actually been documented that there's a word finding problem, and it's always nouns. Like, you can remember adjectives and verbs, but you can't remember nouns. So it's like, what was that person's name? What was that thing? Where were we? So, and it's like they feel like they're getting demented. And the reality is that there is a problem here. It's a cognitive problem. And mood swings, as women transition during the perimenopause, their risk of anxiety and depression in a woman who never had a problem, it doubles. And in women who had a prior problem, like say they had postpartum depression, or they had previous really bad PMS, or they had other anxiety, depression issues, their risk of having a mood disorder when they're transitioning goes up 4 times, fourfold. So women in their 40s, it's unbelievable how many percentage-wise they're on antidepressants and anti-anxiety pharmaceuticals. That's the solution. That's the go-to. It's like, well, we'll just give them all, SSRIs and anxiety pills and sleeping pills, because sleep becomes very disrupted again. Because remember, once you recognize that estradiol, this life hormone from the ovaries, works in the brain and it works in the master clock, you have disruption of mood and memory and sleep, all this, everything that has to do with the neurologic system, including the autonomic nervous system. So that regulates things like pulse and temperature and so on. So they get night sweats and hot flashes and tachycardia, and they go to the cardiologist. It's like, I'm having palpitations. And it's like the cardiologist never recognized, well, you're having hormonal imbalances. No, they put them on beta blockers. It's like the root cause is never looked at or thought about. But if you give women a baseline of estradiol and progesterone, if they need it, by looking at what's happening with their cycle, you can dramatically improve the quality of their life. And we also know that things bad are happening, not just in the brain, but in the cardiovascular system. So you can already start increasing the development of vascular plaque formation during the perimenopausal years, and women during those years preceding the official end of the cycles. Because by definition, menopause is 12 consecutive months without any bleeding, but that's totally arbitrary because the process of ovarian aging is a many-year process. It's not like you cross a finish line. That's arbitrarily thinking about the hormonal changes as period changes and only period changes, when it's really a life total body change. So women start losing bone, for example, their bone density will go down and can go down significantly during the perimenopausal years. And they can also have problems with their joints. Joint pain is very common. They get inflammation in their ligaments and tendons because those are all estrogen dependent structures, like everything in the body. So by giving supplemental hormones appropriately given, it's just supplemental to try to help the brain with the sensors in the brain for the hormones to keep from creating these gigantic fluctuations, because the brain says too little estrogen and it puts out through the pituitary high amounts of the gonadotropins, the FSH and LH. Those are hormones from the pituitary that tell the ovaries to make more estrogen. Well, during the perimenopausal years, the ovaries can still make estrogen. They're just less capable and they become less functional. But if they get this big push from the pituitary, they can have this giant surge of estradiol coming out. And that's when they have migraines suddenly and like, what's happening to me? And they have fluid retention and breast tenderness. But by giving this sort of, we'll say, baseline amount of estradiol, it can help to prevent these giant fluctuations, which, by the way, the most common time of a woman's life for having twins is the perimenopausal years, because they can have like hyperstim to their ovaries by having so much of these gonadotropins. They actually are still having eggs, but they're diminished amounts. They can put out 2 eggs and then they get twins. So everyone beware, you can have twins when you think you're just about at the end of your fertility lifeline. So it's a very challenging time, that perimenopausal time, and it's not a healthy time, and it's not treated. It's not even, there's no roadmap for anything for treating this group except tranquilizers, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and that is not getting to the root cause. So by giving these foundational hormones, we can dramatically change the whole trajectory of the perimenopause and all the years that follow in the menopause.
And just to delineate it a little further, when you say, hormone replacement, menopause and post, and you say supplemental during perimenopause, what do you mean by, is it a dose question or is it a different product?
It can be a dose question, yes,
Okay.
because you're typically I will give less of the hormones to a perimenopausal woman. I'm glad you brought that up. And it all has to be individualized, and it's going to be, these are moving targets, so everything can be in flux. But because the ovaries are making estrogen, still estradiol, and still progesterone, they're actually cycling. Often the cycles get shorter, like a typical menstrual cycle is 28 days. Often theirs will get less, fewer days. And by doing menstrual mapping, you can see exactly what part is getting shorter. Often it's the luteal phase. They make less progesterone for fewer days, and that is why their cycles get shorter. And then eventually it goes from shorter, like menstrual periods, the actual cycle, instead of 28 days goes down to 23 days, even 21. And then after a while, they have these cycles, but they become more spaced out. So maybe instead of getting a period every month, they have them every other month or every third month. And that's, everyone is unique in how they transition, but these are very common types of themes for the transitional years. And when women start spacing out periods and they go like 2-3 months without a period, those women often will need higher amounts of estrogen and progesterone, because we want to get them to have a period on a monthly basis if possible, because that's healthier for their bodies. So everything has to be, especially the menopausal women are actually easier to treat with hormones than the perimenopausal women, because in menopause, they just don't make any. So whatever they get from you. But you just have to figure out how to get it in to get the right levels, because, we give a lot of our estrogen now, we give it through the skin, and the skin was never evolved as a hormone delivery system. It's actually supposed to be a barrier, it's supposed to keep things out. But we know that some people's skin is like a sieve, it just, things get right through it, and everything can get through it to some degree, but it varies from woman to woman. So you have to work at, it's like an adventure, because treating women in the menopause with hormones, because every woman will absorb the hormones differently through her skin. Sometimes you have to try different locations, thinner skin, thicker skin, and so on, different areas of the body to get it just right. But the perimenopause, they have all of those issues on top of the issue of this moving target of fluctuating hormones. So you really have to work one-on-one, and you got to do everything with a little bit of a sense of humor, because, it is a challenging situation. And like I said, there is no clear roadmap. You got to treat each woman individually, recognizing that she's still changing. And then you have to see what's happening and work with levels and work with symptoms. So this is really the art of medicine, is helping women in these situations. And it's so sad that our conventional medical world is really ignoring this gigantic set of women that are going through this phase of life. And it's unavoidable. I mean, people can choose a lot of things, but they can't, if you're a woman, you can't choose that you're going to go into menopause or not. You can't meditate your way out of menopause. You can't exercise your way out. You may delay it 6 months or something, but you're not going to prevent it. And so it's universal for women. It's 100% universal. Doesn't matter your ethnicity, your continent, or anything. Every female will go through menopause. And it's such a big metabolic shift in a woman's body, hormonal shift and metabolic shift. It all goes together, and it's so poorly recognized for what it means. And getting back to like fasting, if you don't give women the proper hormonal balance during these years and all through the menopausal years, and then they try doing different appropriate types of fasting for their age group, like really elderly people over 65, 70. We don't really have good data on safety for multi-day fasting, but we can always go with the time-restricted eating or the intermittent fasting, even unless you're old and really frail. Remember, once again, if you are very frail, if you are very underweight, then those are the people who have to eat more frequently and so on. And of course, every person has to be uniquely evaluated, but you can get all these benefits as you age and go through menopause. And you will never get optimal benefits, though, if you don't have the right hormone balance in your body. As women, we need it. And men, of course, I'm a big fan of men when they need it to have testosterone replacement. But by the way, men should not have testosterone when they're young, because if they have very low testosterone but they're young, then they need to be worked on to find out like their level of toxins, their nutritional status, inflammation status, because once you start giving men testosterone, their testicles may never make testosterone again. It can suppress them permanently. And that's why there's no birth control shot of testosterone for men, because some men will never come back. So really, I don't think men should really go on any testosterone supplementation unless they really have elevations of their gonadotropin. So it shows that they have the equivalent of menopause, like the end organ is not making testosterone, not that it's a, hormonal imbalance because of endocrine disruptors and bad nutrition and stress and that type of thing, which can all affect men's testosterone. So men beware, the clinics that give out all these testosterone shots and such to young men, that is really not a good idea. But for older men, 50 plus, sometimes no matter what you do, you can't get them to make more testosterone, but they need it. And so those are the men that can really benefit from testosterone replacement therapy.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen that so many times with young men that are struggling, and then it becomes a dependency. So this is fascinating, because you've broken down things. You've taken stuff that's complex and often burdensome, made it so easy to understand. which, I'm thankful for, because you're plugging a big gap for everybody, which is, I want to fast. I want to feel great. I have to consider hormone replacement, all of these variables, and you kind of piece it all together and showed us how it's easy to understand. So thank you. And I'm sure there's years and years and thousands of patients worth of experience behind why you make it sound so easy. So thank you. So how do you work with patients? How do people reach out to you if they want to learn more?
I do. I'm a really old-fashioned doctor. I still have a brick and mortar practice where I see patients in person. I do exams, I do all that kind of thing. So my practice is called the Integrative Medical Group of Irvine. So it's in Orange County, Southern California. And I can do a fair amount of telemedicine as well. And I love seeing patients one-on-one. I also try to put out some Instagrams on my Instagram Live. I have 3 books right now out: PCOS SOS, PCOS SOS Fertility Fast Track, and my newest is Menopause, 50 Things You Need to Know. So those are, easily obtained on Amazon. And, I just am looking forward to seeing anyone out there who would like a one-on-one type of medical adventure with me so that we can help, every woman to optimize her health as best as possible.
Thank you. That's amazing. Yeah, I would advise anybody jump on the books. There's 3 certainties in life. There's death, taxes, and menopause.
For a woman, absolutely.
So you might as well read the book and be prepared. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time. Very fascinating. And again, you've taken something that has been a gray area and made it easy to understand. And thankful for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Dr. Talks. We hope today's episode has enlightened and inspired you on your path to optimal health. Each day is a new opportunity to make choices that empower your well-being. For more insights and strategies, subscribe to our podcast and visit our website, www.drtalks.com. Stay connected, stay healthy, and join us next time on Dr. Talks, real talks from real doctors on the issues that matter to you most.